If you wanna see some stuff that is cool, just watch out. Learn things that you didn't know, just watch out. Build a game that we know and love, just watch out. And follow it way outside, just watch out. This is the Swag Show. Captain Comic The Adventure is one of those rare games for the NES that somehow managed to be published without the Nintendo seal of approval, and thus has a funky looking baby blue shell instead of the traditional gray ones. This is because Captain Comic is actually a port from the freeware DOS game. However, this version has had a significant facelift in both graphics and sound. However, unlike the other unlicensed games such as Wally Bear and the No Gang, Captain Comic is actually somewhat playable.
Captain Comic was originally programmed entirely by one man named Michael DeNeo. The only other credit attached to this game is to a guy named Anthony Henderson, who updated the graphics for the NES version. After pressing the start button, it is heavily apparent that only 2 people worked on this. Compared to the god-awful titles of the NES that had many more programmers and a much larger budget though, Captain Comic doesn't seem so bad.
So the story here is that the 3 legendary treasures of Osmic have been stolen by somebody and hidden in the mystical land of Tambi, and now you have to find it. However, you would never know this unless you own the original box or the manual, because there's no mention of it in the actual game. Speaking of the box, there are several quotes on the back talking about how clever, well thought out, and addicting the game is, but all of them are about the PC version. I mean, just imagine how stupid it would have been if Ultra Games had put quotes on the box for TMNT2 about how good the arcade version is instead of the NES version.
Oddly enough, you start this game off being unable to shoot despite the fact that you clearly have a gun in your hand. This means that you have no choice but to try and dodge enemies that immediately come flying at you, and it'll stay this way until you snag the first gun power-up after about a quarter of the way through the level. However, even after you shoot, you'll realize just how useless it is, as you can't even kill enemies that crawl across the ground. You'll have no choice but to jump over them. While the screen is never too overfilled with enemies, whenever there are enemies on the screen, they'll be honing in right on you. It is impossible to play this game without taking many cheap hits. Further adding to this game's frustration is how much everything is at random. Enemies never spawn from the same place, and flying creatures have no recognizable flight pattern.
The game is divided up into 6 distinct locations, and makes it sound like there's only 6 levels in the game, but most of them are actually pretty long and fairly hazardous to traverse. The game soon becomes a brutal combination of both mazes and backtracking, which shouldn't be such a chore if it weren't for the random enemies that popped up every 2 seconds. By the time you get to the cave, you'll probably want to start using a walkthrough, or you'll probably get more lost than when you tried to play Simon's Quest for the first time.
Captain Comic's abysmal sound is one of the game's most incessant reminders of how cheap your playing experience really is. The jumping sound effect is shamelessly ripped straight from Super Mario Bros., and the background music tracks are almost always poorly made attempts at ripping off something from public domain. Captain Comic loves to screw with you by consistently demanding many difficult jumps. The main problem with this though is that most of the time, you probably won't make them on your first try. With 0 continues and a lack of abundance in 1-ups, you'll be starting from scratch many times over in your adventure. This is the one thing that Color Dreams failed to rip off in their attempt at mimicking Nintendo. Metroid on the NES had the decency to provide continues, so why couldn't they?
To me, the biggest programming error in this game is that you are not granted any amount of time of invincibility after being hit. That means that if 3 enemies that you can't avoid are coming at you at once and all strike you in succession, you take 3 hits without any recovery time. I also think that some of the power-ups come way too late in the game, most notably the corkscrew shot. Until you get this weapon, you are nearly defenseless against enemies that travel along the ground, and you have to travel through some very tight corridors to get it. This means that you have no choice but to get hit by many enemies until you get this gun.
Captain Comic features what I like to call the Sonic Syndrome. While our good friend the Captain here can surely run fast, try it and you won't be around for much longer. Utilizing your speed will only send you to an even quicker death. This really sucks too, as you'll always be on the run, trying to escape from the respawning enemies.
The Invincibility Shield is an item that will randomly drop off of an enemy, but is invaluable in making progress in the game. While I appreciate that it exists, nothing pissed me off more than killing an enemy that was over a pit and watching the power-up drop into nothingness. Same thing goes for the 1-ups, and it is aggravating.
Captain Comic is one of those games where I want to say that if it were a completely different game, Programmed by, well, a completely different person, it might have had a small chance at being good. While most people will automatically reject Captain Comic, there is a very small sense of ambition hidden deep within here. There is an entire world similar to Metroid with several different pathways set up for you to explore. The background successfully managed to set a mysterious science fiction vibe, which might draw you in for at least a couple extra minutes. Sadly though, just about everything else about this game is unwieldy shit not worth spending time on. Captain Comic isn't exactly Battletoads or Ghosts and Goblins in terms of difficulty, but then it's still not worth playing as the entire game engine is wretched. Captain Comic shall forever remain a small footnote in the history of unlicensed NES games. I wouldn't ever recommend it to anyone as there is hardly any appeal at all.
Unless you are a serious collector of retro games, I can't think of any reason why you'd want to own Captain Comic. It's fairly difficult and the ending is pretty anticlimactic, but it is interesting to see an unlicensed game that was made by only 2 people that is better than a lot of the shit that Nintendo did dish out their seal of quality for.